In this, the 26th lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we examine what happened during the period of experimentation with a new form of conventional economic wisdom. Successive Congresses and presidential administrations in the United States accepted the challenge of producing all the guns and all the butter demanded to meet the obligations of the world's wealthiest social democracy. Other nations struggled with similar challenges. What economists have tended to argue is that the amount spent is less important than the percentage of GDP. In the 1970s, a skyrocketing national debt was not yet a problem for the United States. That was about to change, and change quickly. However, by the late 1970s, the economic engine crafted out of the Second World War was no longer functioning as anticipated. Richard Nixon's economic advisors had convinced him to impose price controls over oil supplies. With domestic prices half the world price by 1977, U.S. companies and consumers had no incentive to conserve oil. Automobile manufacturers were, as a result, slow to replace gas-guzzling vehicles with more efficient models. The Carter administration responded with measures to encourage conservation and the development of new sources of energy, while allowing oil prices to rise to world market levels. Revolution in Iran erupted in 1978, leading to a serious reduction in world oil supplies. Speculators drove up oil prices even higher, and OPEC raised prices accordingly. For consumers everywhere, the cost of living climbed. The impact in the United States was far greater than in some other countries, where high oil prices over many years had stimulated conservation and energy efficiency. Investors moved huge sums into gold, the price of which reached nearly $1,000 an ounce in 1980. Chrysler Motors had to be bailed out by the federal government to prevent closing down. A financial crisis now hit the global economy. The U.S. dollar went into a free fall, causing domestic prices to climb. However, demand for U.S. goods increased in other countries as prices in terms of foreign currencies fell. The Carter administration convinced its major trading partners to help rescue the dollar. Paul Volcker, the newly appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, now stepped in to attack inflation. Nowhere in the halls of government or among the government's teams of economic advisors was there a serious discussion of responding to the financial challenges by changing the way government raises its revenue to unburden earned income and begin to collect the rental value of land. Absent from the discussions at economics conferences or even the economic literature was a recognition that by definition taxation is the imposition of penalties on the production of goods or the providing of services. At the same time, the failure of government to collect the full annual rental value of land or land-like assets extends an unearned financial gain to those who control nature. The consequences have proven to be devastating to societies. British author Ronald Burgess, a member of the Royal Economic Society in Britain, made this point well in his 1993 book, Public Revenue Without Taxation. Burgess wrote that the freely elected governments of contemporary trading economies, with the acquiescence of their electorates, persist in raising the major part, if not all, of their revenues by means of taxation. The immediate cause of such action by governments and the acquiescence of their electorates is ignorance of any acceptable alternative method of raising sufficient public revenue. The proponents of lowering the marginal tax rates on high individual incomes and on the gains from the sale of financial assets were finding support within the ranks of fiscal conservatives. Their assertions did not go unchallenged, however. As momentum grew behind supply-side proposals, University of Wisconsin economics professor Arthur P. Becker offered his views on the measures required to achieve sustainable economic growth. Becker wrote, "Economic incentive to invest and work, and thereby to increase employment and production, which in turn could prevent prices from rising as much, is maximized when all of the national income is channeled into the hands of those who contribute to production. This does not preclude public sector activities which are supported by the majority of producers, both workers and investors. Unfortunately, the private enterprise system in the United States has suffered an erosion of those very incentives upon which its well-being depends. The drain of the economic rent of land is the most pervasive income drain of all. Since land and its services are supplied by nature, the economic rent of land constitutes a surplus payment for production, and therefore one variety of non-productive income. Because all economic activity requires the use of land for space and for other resources as well, the drain imposed by land rents for leasing or land values for purchase is inevitable and enormous, ranging all the way from choice urban land sites to oil lands. Few of his colleagues paid much attention to what Arthur Becker and a small group of economists holding similar views were saying and writing about the rent fund associated with land. As the developed economies increasingly lost manufacturing activity to locations with much lower wage levels and few, if any, restrictions on production methods, economists debated trade policies. Some economists argue that a trade deficit, that is, importing more in value than a country exports, is not a long-term problem. Andre Rodriguez-Clare, professor of economics at Penn State University, for example, stated the case as follows. The more you import, the more you export. When you import, you are sending dollars abroad, and then people turn around and use those dollars to buy U.S. goods. We shouldn't think about trade in terms of creating and destroying jobs, but as a transformation of jobs. A dynamic economy means that while jobs are lost in manufacturing, they are gained in high technology fields like the biomedical industry and software engineering. I think that the U.S. has wisely chosen to let change happen and then deal with the negative consequences of trade, compensate people, help them find other jobs, help them in the transition. To a degree, the U.S. economy and the economies of other high-wage social democracies have responded by the expansion of employment in areas where greater technical skills and educational credentials yield greater compensation. Yet lower-wage countries have demonstrated their workers are more and more able to perform similarly when the nation's infrastructure is also updated to global standards. As a result, the competition for these jobs has only intensified, leaving millions of people to compete for lower-paying service sector employment where wages are low and benefits minimal. As the 1970s progressed, U.S. resources seemed to be insufficient to fight the external wars against communist advances and also saw the problems of civil rights and poverty at home. Earlier, Martin Luther King Jr., among others, had made this very point. King declared, "There is a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle, It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. Then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Even considering the enormous diversion of resources to the military, by the late 1960s it became clear to many that expenditures on public goods and services had been seriously misallocated. As Arthur Becker and other critics of mainstream economic policy understood, all of the financial and profit motive incentives were in the direction of non-productive speculation that exacerbated the problems of the old industrial cities. Historian Godfrey Hodgson commented on just how rapidly the disinvestment had occurred. After a decade of prosperity in the suburbs and of decay and despair in the inner city, the physical contrast between the two environments had swollen to the dimensions of an allegorical fantasy, and the moral schizophrenia kept pace. Lyndon Johnson, still hoping to find solutions to the problems of the cities, appointed former U.S. Senator Paul Douglas to chair the National Commission on Urban Problems. As you may recall, Douglas had earned his doctorate in economics from Columbia University in 1921, teaching at the universities of Chicago and Massachusetts, among others, before entering government service and being elected to the U.S. Senate in 1948. As a strong proponent of urban renewal, Douglas expressed great disappointment that the Commission failed to endorse measures he felt were essential for returning the cities to economic health and stability. Douglas warned, "We are becoming properly aware of the need for land reform in the countrysides of Asia and Latin America. There is an even greater need for land reform in the cities and suburbs all over the world, even our own country included." This is not to be obtained by a subdivision of the land, which is possible in farming but not in crowded cities and suburbs, but rather by society asserting the right to the differential rents and values which the forces of fertility and productivity create. So here was a major report, researched and released by people who examined closely the economic factors at play in the cities. And of course, its most important recommendations were ignored and shelved. The interests of land speculators once again trumped those of the community as a whole. This graph shows that the productivity of the United States manufacturing sector was increasing at a significant annual rate. The social issue was and is that more and more is being produced by fewer and fewer workers. Near the end of his remarkable treatment of the history of our era, historian Carroll Quigley compared the United States with its great adversary, the Soviet Union. In terms of the economic system, he wrote, "The American economy is unique because it is the only economy that no longer operates in terms of scarce resources. It may be inside a framework of scarce resources, but this framework is so much wider than the other limiting features of the system, notably its fiscal and financial arrangements, that the system itself does not operate within any limits established by that wider framework." Economist Joan Robinson, who took Keynesian analysis to positions Keynes would never have contemplated, examined the state of economics as a scientific discipline in 1967 in a book titled Economics, An Awkward Quarter. She observed, "It is impossible to understand the economic system in which we are living if we try to interpret it as a rational scheme. It has to be understood as an awkward phase in a continuing process of historical development. The future is by no means secure. We have not yet seen whether the rest of the capitalist world could weather a serious recession in the United States. We cannot foresee how the trading nations will muddle themselves out of the international monetary system they have muddled themselves into. But there is good reason to hope that nothing quite so stupid as the great slump will be allowed to occur." As events have proven, the fine-tuning tools embraced by economists were insufficient to overcome the deeply entrenched privileges of landed interests, driven to extremes by new legal powers granted to corporations as they merged and moved beyond the regulatory reach of domestic governments. While economists argued their respective cases for policies based on Keynesian, monetarist, neoclassical, or laissez-faire theoretical models, historians were recording the debates and attempting to find meaning in the mountains of papers, reports, and books on economic subjects. Godfrey Hodgson, in America in Our Time, wrote of the widening gap between the theoretical world of the new economics and the real world in which people lived. Everywhere by the early 70s, the expansive vision of boundless frontiers was giving way to the metaphor of spaceship Earth. The world was seen not as virgin prairie awaiting the plow, but as a fragile nest whose brood must fight for scarce resources. Hodgson then quoted from the most recent edition of the economics textbook written by Professor Paul Samuelson. Samuelson wrote, "In this edition, I have particularly emphasized unsolved problems in modern economics: cost-push inflation, the quality of life versus mere GNP growth." Alfred Mehrabian Jr. in 1994 reflected on his long association with economists while serving as economics editor of the Wall Street Journal. Mehrabian wrote, "In the early 1970s, from November 1973 to March 1975, the economy suffered its longest, most severe downturn since the 1930s. Less than a decade later, in mid-1981, an even harsher downturn struck. When the sinking economy finally hit bottom near the end of 1982, 11% of the labor force was unemployed, and many economists, for the first time since the 1930s, are using the term depression to describe the business landscape. Clearly, economics was in need of a thorough theoretical and practical re-examination. A growing number of critics were sounding the alarms, each with a different perspective. Here and there, the unresolved historical land question was addressed." We reach the end of Lesson 26.